You're looking to understand the big shifts shaping our world, to cut through the noise and really grasp what's going on.
Yeah, we get that.
That's what this is all about.
We're trying to take dense, really crucial information and pull out the core insights.
So you walk away with a clear, informed perspective without feeling, buried under it all.
Exactly.
And today we're tackling two major pieces of the puzzle. First, we're diving into the impact of climate change on global power dynamics.
Right. That's from the International Journal of Policy Studies, Volume 4, Issue 2 from 2024.
And alongside that,
We'll be looking at the VDEM Democracy Report 2025. VDEM is Varieties of Democracy.
okay.
And this report, it marks a quarter century of their research into, well, global trends in democratization and autocratization.
Got it. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to unravel how climate change is actively redrawing the map of global influence.
And then connect those shifts to the current state of democracy, or maybe its erosion in countries around the world.
Okay, let's unpack this first part. Climate change and who holds the power. The IJPS study, it wasn't just like looking at data from afar, was it?
No, not at all. They took a really insightful approach. It's what they call a mixed methods approach.
Meaning,
Meaning they combined in-depth interviews with a whole range of people, policymakers, climate scientists, people from international organizations.
right.
Across really diverse regions. We're talking South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, North America, the Middle East, even the Arctic. And this was between 2018 and 2022.
Wow, comprehensive.
Yeah, and then they analyzed all that firsthand information alongside the existing academic stuff, policy briefs, reports from big players like the IPCC, the UN, the World Bank.
So they're getting the on-the-ground reality and seeing how it fits the bigger picture.
Exactly.
And the study really zeroes in on how climate change is messing with some pretty fundamental aspects of how the world works, right?
Precisely. Their core focus is on how climate change influences how essential resources get allocated, how nations behave on the international stage, and how it affects the actual mechanisms of international governance.
And how did they track that?
They used a method called thematic data analysis that helped them identify concrete examples like actual instances of resource competition, economic instability, new security challenges, all driven by climate change.
And what did they find about how this is actually changing relationships between countries? I mean, if resources and economies are impacted.
Yeah, how does that translate?
Right. How does it shift how countries interact?
Well, the study's findings point to a pretty significant trend. Climate change is actively reshaping international relationships.
Well, is shaping them how?
It's leading to a realignment of power within different regions. So it's not just theoretical. It's about countries forming, new alliances, adjusting their strategies because of climate impacts.
So the traditional ways we think about power, economic might, military strength, are those being redefined too?
Absolutely. Definitely on the economic side.
Yeah.
The study highlights that this whole shift to a low-carbon economy, it isn't just about the environment.
It's strategic.
It's a major strategic economic opportunity. Nations leading the way in developing and implementing green tech, solar, wind, all that.
They get an advantage.
The distinct advantage.
Yeah.
This isn't just environmentalism. It's creating a new kind of geopolitical leverage. You could almost say access to green tech is becoming the new oil.
Huh. The new oil. That's interesting. And it's not just about who has the biggest army anymore, is it?
That's a really crucial insight the study makes. The tensions coming from climate change. They're often quite different from traditional conflicts.
How so?
Instead of being mainly about borders or ideology, these tensions often center on, well, the vulnerabilities of ecosystems and the basic survival needs of people.
Right, like water access or food security.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is these issues tend to cross national boundaries. They're transboundaries.
And they involve more than just governments.
Often, yes. You see non-traditional actors getting involved. NGOs, local communities, sometimes even corporations.
Okay. And looking ahead, what kind of global landscape does the study anticipate based on these trends?
Well, one potential future scenario they explore is the emergence of what they call a green oligopoly.
A green oligopoly. What does that mean exactly?
It's a situation where a small number of nations, the ones really at the forefront of renewable energy and climate innovation,
Yeah.
they could become the dominant players on the global stage. They'd hold a lot of the cards, so to speak.
So a few countries could really wield significant influence just based on their green tech leadership.
That's a possibility they consider, yes.
Okay.
But the study also really underscores a critical need here.
Which is?
For global stability in this kind of evolving landscape, we need inclusive governance frameworks.
Okay, meaning.
Frameworks that can effectively balance the individual national interests of countries with the collective need for meaningful climate action. It's a tough balancing act.
That makes a lot of sense. It can't just be a race where only a few win. Okay, let's shift gears now to our second key source, the VDEM Democracy Report 2025.
Right.
And this report, it paints a rather concerning picture of the state of democracy globally, doesn't it?
It really does. Yeah. The report's main finding is stark. The global decline in democracy actually got worse in 2024.
Worse how? How do they measure that?
They use various metrics, but one key one is territory-weighted averages. And based on that, their analysis shows the level of democracy worldwide has fallen back.
Back to when?
Back to levels last seen in 1986.
Wow, 1986. That's a significant regression.
It really is. Decades of progress, seemingly reversed in many places.
And it seems like some of the world's most populous nations are caught up in this trend.
That's a major point of concern, yeah. The report highlights that among the 5 most populous countries, China, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, and the USA, according to their latest assessment, only the United States is still classified as a democracy. And even its democratic status, they note, appears to be facing challenges.
That's a really startling statistic, 1 out of the 5 biggest. And what about the types of governments that are becoming more common?
Well, liberal democracy is often seen as the sort of benchmark, with strong protections for individual rights and checks and balances.
Yeah.
They're now the least common type of government globally. Their numbers are down to levels not seen since 1990, right around when the Cold War was ending.
So the wave of democratization we saw then has really receded.
It seems so, based on their data.
And it's not just about whether elections happen, right? The report digs into some fundamental freedoms.
Absolutely. Freedom of expression, for instance, has seen a truly alarming decline globally.
What does that cover? Media freedom.
It covers a lot. Media freedom, yes, the safety of journalists, but also even the freedom for ordinary citizens to discuss political issues openly without fear.
And it sounds like another core pillar of democracy, the ability to actually have meaningful public discussions, debates, that's also under pressure.
Exactly. Deliberation. They measure that as a crucial element of a healthy democracy, and it saw a sharp decrease in 2024.
So less debate, less public reasoning.
The report indicates more countries saw deterioration in deliberation than saw improvement. It suggests a shrinking space for inclusive public discussion and maybe less respect for differing views.
The report also names names, right? It identifies specific countries moving in different directions.
It does. They point to countries currently undergoing what they term autocratization, moving away from democracy. Examples include Myanmar, Pakistan, El Salvador, Niger.
But there are some positive signs, too.
On a more hopeful note, yes. They also identify countries like Poland, Botswana, and Guatemala, where autocratization seems to have halted or even reversed recently. So it's not uniform decline everywhere.
That's good to hear. Now, what's the specific concept they mentioned? Bell-turn autocratization.
Ah, yes. Bell-turn autocratization. It describes a really worrying pattern.
Which is?
It's where a country experiences a period of democratic opening, some progress.
Okay.
But then it's closely followed by a slide back towards authoritarianism.
Right.
Like taking 1 step forward and then 2 steps back, often deliberately undermining the new democratic institutions.
And they give examples.
They cite Armenia, Mali, El Salvador, and Niger as recent examples fitting this pattern.
So what are some of the common tools or tactics used by governments heading down this autocratization path?
According to the VDEM report, a preferred tactic is censoring the media. That comes up frequently.
Okay, controlling information. What else?
They also highlight a growing trend of attacks on the independence and autonomy of election management bodies, the EMBs.
The groups that run the election.
Exactly. If you compromise their independence, you really strike at the heart of the democratic process, don't you?
Definitely.
And on top of that, the report indicates an increase in government intimidation of the political opposition, especially during election periods. In several of these countries, it just skews the whole playing field.
No, the report also takes a specific look at the United States, particularly during the Trump administration. What were some of the concerns raised there? And just a reminder to you listening, we're reporting the findings here, not taking sides.
Right. The VDEM report assesses that during that period, there were efforts observed to undermine the independence of the judiciary.
How so?
Well, attacking the rule of law more broadly. and weakening institutions designed for accountability.
Do they give specific examples?
Yes, they mention things like the pardoning of individuals involved in the January 6th Capitol Hill events, the removal of independent inspector generals from various departments.
Right, the watchdogs.
Exactly. And instances where the administration asserted very broad, sometimes seemingly unchecked executive authority.
And it wasn't just the judiciary or accountability bodies, was it? The media also faced pressure.
Yes, the report highlights that too. Instances of intimidation of the media. Things like threats to challenge broadcast licenses, pursuing legal action against publishers who used anonymous sources, and also cases where access for the press pool was restricted.
The report even touches on some more recent things, like Elon Musk's acquisition of X, which used to be Twitter.
It does mention concerns raised around that, specifically about Musk's DOGE project potentially not adhering to data privacy laws,
Okay.
and also the dismissal of some USAID officers, which they note could potentially impact international democracy support efforts, given USAID's big role there.
It's interesting how these different threads, tech platforms, foreign aid, can all connect back to these broader democracy trends. Now, just to be clear on their methods, how does VDEM actually measure all this? It sounds complex.
It is complex. They use a system relying on expert ratings. They have thousands of country experts around the world who provide assessments on hundreds of specific indicators of democracy.
Okay, so expert judgments.
Yes, but their methodology is quite rigorous. They try to account for the reliability of individual experts and also for potential differences in how experts might interpret the rating scales. They have statistical models for that.
So they're trying to make it as consistent and robust as possible.
That's the goal.
And the report includes some commentary from the lead researchers at VDEM themselves, right? Did they add any caveats or key takeaways?
They did. While they generally stand by the report's overall findings about democratic decline, they do raise a couple of important points.
Like what?
Well, they advise caution against overinterpreting those population-weighted measures we talked about earlier.
Why is that?
Because developments in just a few very populous countries, like China or India, can heavily skew those global averages. It might mask improvements happening in smaller countries.
Ah, okay. Good point.
And they also stress the importance of remembering there's always some measurement uncertainty when you're trying to quantify something as complex as democracy. The trends are clear, but we should be mindful of the nuances.
Right. So while the overall trend is definitely concerning, it's important to look at the details and acknowledge the limitations of the data. Okay, so we've explored how climate change is shifting global power dynamics.
Right, the IJPS study.
And we've examined these worrying trends in democracy worldwide from the VDEM report.
Yeah, the decline back to 86 levels, the pressures on free expression.
Exactly. Now, for the really crucial connection, how might these two massive forces, climate change impacts and democracy trends, actually interact with each other?
This is where it gets really intricate and, frankly, potentially quite consequential for the future.
So let's start with that green oligopoly idea.
Okay, if that scenario plays out, as the IJPS study suggests it might, you could see a significant concentration of power in those few nations leading the green tech race.
And the impact.
Well, that could have substantial implications for global governance, for equity. It could put other nations, especially developing ones, at a considerable disadvantage. Let's say, less access.
And what about the resource competition aspect? Climate change is bound to make things like water, fertile land, even certain minerals scarcer, right?
Absolutely. And intensified competition for those resources, driven by climate change, could very well pour fuel on existing geopolitical fires.
Making tensions worse.
Exactly. It might destabilize democratic nations that are already struggling to manage these pressures internally. Or, conversely,
Yes.
it could provide opportunities for autocratic regimes to consolidate their power. They might promise stability, control over dwindling resources, even if it means less freedom.
That's a grim possibility. But on the flip side, could democratic nations that are leading the way in climate solutions actually see their international standing improve?
That's certainly a potential positive outcome, yes. Democratic nations that successfully develop and implement effective, equitable climate solutions could really strengthen their international reputation.
And their influence.
And their influence,
Yeah.
potentially. They could become models for other countries, strengthening diplomatic ties through cooperation on climate action.
So it seems the way different government types respond to the climate crisis could either bolster or weaken their global position.
Precisely. The growing focus on resilience, on sustainability in a world being reshaped by climate change. They could favor governments that are transparent, accountable, responsive to their citizens.
Qualities often associated with democracies.
Right. But, as we just discussed, there's the other side, too. Autocratic regimes might try to leverage climate challenges, emergencies, disasters to justify more control, more restrictions, all in the name of stability.
A sort of climate authoritarianism.
It's a concern, yes.
And thinking back to the VDEM findings, the erosion of democratic freedoms we're seeing in some places, like freedom of expression or attacks on institutions, how might that impact their ability to actually deal with climate change effectively?
That's a really critical link. The VDEM report's findings about declining free expression, weakening institutions, and autocratizing nations, that raises serious concerns for climate action.
Why specifically?
Well, think about it. If you can't have open public discussion, if scientists or activists or journalists are muzzled, if institutions are weak or corrupted.
It's hard to tackle complex problems.
Exactly. It could significantly hinder effective climate action. You need open debate. You need critical feedback. You need strong, accountable institutions to develop and implement sound, sustainable climate strategies that actually work for people.
So clamping down on democracy could actually make a country less resilient to climate change in the long run.
It certainly seems plausible. It cuts off valuable information, hinders innovation, and can lead to policies that benefit elites rather than the whole society facing the environmental threat.
It really is a complex web, isn't it? Climate change isn't just over here as an environmental issue.
No, not at all.
It's deeply tangled up with economics, international security, and, as we're seeing so clearly from these reports, the very nature of how countries are governed.
That's the core insight, really. These aren't separate trends happening in isolation. They are profoundly interconnected.
And their interplay is likely to shape global politics in really significant ways in the coming years and decades.
Absolutely.
So after taking this deep dive into these two important sources, it's clear that the relationship between climate change, global power dynamics, and the future of democracy is incredibly intricate.
And potentially quite volatile. The information we've explored today, it offers a valuable snapshot, right? Current analysis, potential future scenarios based on these expert studies.
But it's a constantly evolving situation. These reports give us crucial insights into the powerful forces at play right now.
Definitely.
And that really brings us to you listening. We hope this has given you some valuable perspectives to consider as the world continues to grapple with the growing impacts of climate change.
How will this shifting balance of global power, influenced by climate responses and green tech, shape the future trajectory of democratic governance around the world?
And maybe even more importantly, what role can our societies play in trying to work towards a future that is both environmentally sustainable and fundamentally democratic?
It's a huge question. No easy answers.
Yeah.
But it's one we really encourage you to keep thinking about.